The courtroom was deathly silent. Frank Callahan could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, as if he were a criminal about to be locked away. The judge's gavel came down hard on the bench, echoing throughout the room, sealing a fate he had never imagined facing. This court finds Frank Callahan guilty of corruption and obstruction of justice. The murmurs were immediate. The venomous whispers spread through the rows of spectators, laced with shock, disbelief, and contempt. His former colleagues from the police force avoided his gaze. Some wore expressions of disappointment. Others simply refused to look in his direction. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads. Reporters whispered live updates into their microphones, and camera flashes lit up the room, capturing the exact moment when a man once called a hero was brought down. Frank swallowed hard, a bitter taste in his mouth. His name, once respected, was now forever tainted. 30 years of service to the law, locking away criminals, risking his life to protect his city, and all of it had been wiped away in an instant. His face was plastered across newspapers, labeled a fraud, a man who had deceived everyone. But he knew the truth. He had been betrayed. Beside him, seated firm and still like a soldier standing guard, was Billy, his strong, intelligent German shepherd. The dog sniffed the air, alert to every movement around them. He didn't understand the words being spoken, but he could smell the tension, the fear, and the injustice weighing down on his owner. Frank lowered his hand and ran his fingers through Billy's thick fur. The dog let out a deep sigh and rested his muzzle on Frank's knee, as if to say, "I'm here," and maybe Billy was the only one who still was. "Mr. Callahan," the judge's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. "Sentencing will be determined in 3 weeks. Until then, you will remain under house arrest." Court is adjourned. Another strike of the gavel. A sharp crack, and it felt as if Frank's world had shattered into pieces. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to contain the anger rising in his chest like a wildfire. He wasn't a perfect man, but he had never betrayed the badge he wore with honor. Someone had set him up. Someone who knew every detail of his life, every weakness, every old wound. But who and why? The guards approached to escort him out of the courtroom. He felt the firm grip of their hands on his shoulders and heard a low growl from Billy, who instinctively took a step forward. The guards hesitated, but Frank gave a slight signal with his hand. Billy was trained to protect his owner at all costs. If he wanted to, no one in that room would take another step. As he was led toward the exit, Frank lifted his gaze and saw something that sent a chill down his spine. At the back of the room, hidden in the shadows, a man was watching him with a faint smirk on his lips, the kind of smirk only a traitor would wear. Cold, calculating, satisfied. Frank felt his stomach turn. He knew who had done this to him, but proving his innocence, that was another story, and the only one who could help him do it was Billy. Frank sat in silence in his dimly lit living room, the weight of the accusations pressing down on him like an iron chain. The walls, once decorated with commendations and medals, now seemed like hollow reminders of a life that had been stripped away. His wheelchair creaked slightly as he adjusted his position, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career putting criminals behind bars, but now he was the one labeled as the enemy. Outside, reporters gathered like vultures, waiting for a glimpse of the disgraced officer. Billy lay at his feet, ears twitching at every sound outside. The German shepherd was more than just a loyal companion. He was trained to sense danger before it even arrived. And right now, his body was tense, as if he knew something was coming. Frank absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur, his thoughts drifting back to the moment in the courtroom when he had locked eyes with that man. That smirk, that smug, knowing look. Someone had set him up, and whoever it was had planned everything perfectly. His hands clenched into fists. He had spent years chasing down criminals, learning their tactics, understanding how they operated. And now, he needed to use that same knowledge to clear his own name. But how? Every piece of evidence pointed directly at him. His bank accounts showed unexplained transactions. His name was on documents authorizing deals he never approved. And worst of all, the people he trusted had already turned their backs on him. He had no badge, no allies, no voice in a system that had already judged him. The soft sound of scratching at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Billy was on his feet instantly. His ears perked, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Frank's heart pounded. He wheeled himself closer to the door and peered through the peephole. A shadow moved outside. He wasn't expecting anyone. A folded envelope slid under the door. Billy sniffed at it cautiously before stepping back, his tail stiff. Frank hesitated, then picked it up with careful hands. The envelope was plain, no markings, no return address. But inside, there was a single photograph. And when Frank saw it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of him, shaking hands with a man he had never met before. And beneath it, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "You should have taken the deal." Frank stared at the photograph, his pulse pounding in his ears. The image was grainy but clear enough, him in uniform, shaking hands with a man he didn't recognize. The setting looked official, maybe a meeting or a deal being made. But Frank knew with absolute certainty that he had never met this man before. Someone had manufactured this photo, planting evidence to frame him. His grip tightened on the paper as a cold realization settled in. Whoever was behind this wanted him to feel trapped. Billy paced near the door, sniffing the air, his tail stiff with unease. The German shepherd could sense the shift in Frank's energy, the tension radiating from him like heat off the pavement. Frank ran a hand over his face, trying to piece together what this meant. If someone had gone through the trouble of creating fake evidence, it meant they had access to official records, maybe even law enforcement files. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was bigger. He wheeled himself toward his desk, opening a drawer where he kept an old burner phone, one he used only when dealing with confidential informants in the past. He hesitated before dialing, his instincts warning him that every move he made was being watched. But he had no choice. He needed someone who still owed him a favor. After a few rings, a voice answered, low and cautious. "Callahan, didn't think I'd be hearing from you." "I need information," Frank said, keeping his voice steady. "There's a setup, and I need to know who's pulling the strings." A pause, then a short chuckle. "You must be desperate. Nobody wants to be seen talking to you right now. You're radioactive." Frank's jaw tightened. He glanced down at the photograph again, his gut telling him that this was just the beginning. "Then you better make it worth your while," he said, "because I'm not going down alone." The line went silent for a moment before the voice responded. "Meet me tomorrow. Usual spot. Midnight. And don't bring anyone." Frank hung up, exhaling slowly. He glanced at Billy, who was now sitting attentively by his side. His deep brown eyes locked onto his. "Looks like we have work to do, partner." The dog let out a low huff, as if he understood. But deep down, Frank knew. Whoever had set him up wasn't just trying to ruin him. They were making sure he never got back up. Midnight felt different when you were the hunted. Frank waited in the shadows of an abandoned parking lot, his back against the cold metal of his old pickup truck. Billy sat beside him, alert, his ears twitching at every distant noise. The city was never truly silent, but tonight, the usual sounds, the hum of traffic, the occasional siren, felt distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Frank tightened his grip on the envelope in his lap, the fabricated photo inside it a constant reminder that someone wanted him silenced. Headlights appeared in the distance, creeping toward him like a predator stalking its prey. Frank tensed. He had chosen this spot for a reason, open enough that no one could sneak up on him, but dark enough to avoid prying eyes. The black sedan rolled to a stop a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, moving with the kind of cautious confidence that came from knowing too much. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," the man muttered, stopping just out of arm's reach. He was younger than Frank remembered, but the years had hardened him. Eddie Vasquez, former street informant, now operating in the gray space between the law and the criminals it chased. Frank held up the photograph without a word. Eddie took it, studying it under the dim glow of the streetlights. He let out a low whistle. "This is clean work." Whoever did this had access to high-level forgery tech. Not the kind of thing your average thug can pull off. He looked up, eyes narrowed. You really pissed off the wrong people, Callahan. Frank's jaw tightened. I need names, Eddie. Who could have planted this? Who's pulling the strings? Eddie hesitated, shifting on his feet. He wasn't a man who rattled easily, but something about this made him uneasy. He glanced around, lowering his voice. Word on the street is, someone high up wanted you out of the way. And not just out of the department, out of the picture completely. You were asking too many questions about something you weren't supposed to. He handed the photo back. This isn't just a setup, Callahan. It's a warning. Frank exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Someone wanted him buried, but they had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. He wasn't just going to clear his name. He was going to burn down whoever did this to him. Frank gripped the photograph tightly, his pulse steady but his mind racing. If Eddie was right, this wasn't just about framing him, it was about erasing him. Someone with real power wanted him gone, and they weren't afraid to play dirty. Billy shifted beside him, his sharp eyes locked onto Eddie, as if sensing the tension in the air. The German Shepherd didn't trust easily, and right now, Frank wasn't sure if he should either. Eddie glanced over his shoulder, his usual street confidence shaken. Listen, Callahan, I shouldn't even be talking to you. Whoever's behind this has reach. People are scared. The kind of scared that makes them disappear without a trace. He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. But I owe you, so I'll give you a name. He leaned in slightly, voice barely above a whisper. Vincent Moreau. The name hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Moreau was a ghost, a man who operated in the shadows, laundering money, pulling strings, making people vanish. He wasn't some street thug. He was the kind of criminal that cops whispered about but could never touch. If Moreau was involved, Frank wasn't dealing with a personal vendetta. He was up against something much bigger than he had imagined. Billy let out a low growl, his ears pricked toward the darkness beyond the parking lot. Eddie stiffened, his hand inching toward his pocket. Frank's instincts kicked in, and he reached for the small pistol hidden under his jacket. The air had shifted. They weren't alone anymore. A car engine roared to life in the distance, tires screeching against the pavement. Frank barely had time to react before a burst of gunfire shattered the silence. Eddie cursed, diving for cover behind his car, while Frank spun his wheelchair behind a concrete barrier. Billy barked furiously, his body coiled, ready to attack. Bullets sparked against metal, the night erupting into chaos. Frank gritted his teeth, gripping his weapon. They weren't just sending a message anymore. They were here to finish the job. The gunfire ripped through the night, each shot echoing off the empty parking lot like rolling thunder. Frank pressed his back against the concrete barrier, gripping his pistol tightly. Billy was crouched low beside him, his sharp eyes locked onto the direction of the attack. The dog's muscles were tense, ready to spring into action at Frank's command. But Frank knew they were outgunned. He needed to think fast. Eddie cursed from behind his car, fumbling for his own weapon. I told you, Callahan, you're not supposed to be asking questions. He shouted over the chaos. Another round of bullets shattered the driver's side window of his sedan, sending shards of glass raining onto the pavement. Eddie ducked lower, eyes wild with panic. We gotta move, man, or we're dead. Frank stole a quick glance past the barrier. A black SUV sat at the far end of the lot, its headlights off, but he could see the faint glow of muzzle flashes from inside. Professional hitters. No hesitation, no wasted bullets. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an execution. And if they didn't act now, they wouldn't live to see the morning. Billy, go, Frank ordered, pointing toward the shadows. The German Shepherd bolted, weaving through the darkness, his speed and training making him nearly invisible. Frank knew the dog would flank their attackers, creating just enough distraction for him and Eddie to make a move. A second later, a furious snarl ripped through the night, followed by a startled scream. Billy had made contact. Seizing the opportunity, Frank fired 2 precise shots toward the SUV, aiming for the tires. The loud pop of rubber bursting was followed by a sharp curse from inside the vehicle. Eddie didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward Frank, grabbing the handles of his wheelchair and pushing with all his strength. "We're getting the hell out of here," he yelled. As the SUV's engine roared to life, Frank caught one last glimpse of the attackers. Shadowed figures retreating into the vehicle, but not before he saw something chilling. The emblem on the SUV's door. Not a gang symbol. Not some underground crime ring. It was a government plate. His blood ran cold. Whoever wanted him dead wasn't just a criminal. They had power, and they had connections in places Frank never expected. The SUV tore out of the parking lot, tires screeching as the assassins vanished into the night. Eddie kept pushing Frank's wheelchair, his breath ragged, his hands gripping the handles with white-knuckled force. Billy sprinted beside them, his ears pinned back, his body tense with adrenaline. They couldn't stop moving, not yet. Frank's mind was racing, replaying the image of that government plate burned into his memory. This wasn't just a setup. This was a cover-up. And whoever was behind it had access to resources far beyond anything he had imagined. Eddie finally slowed down near a dark alley, glancing over his shoulder. "We lost M," he muttered, hands on his knees, catching his breath. "But that ain't gonna last. They'll find us, Callahan. People like that, they don't let loose ends walk away." He turned to Frank, his expression grim. "Who the hell did you piss off?" Frank exhaled, steadying himself. "Vincent Moreau," he said, the name feeling heavier now. "And apparently he's got friends in high places." He looked down at Billy, who was still on high alert, his head swiveling, scanning the area for threats. The dog had saved them tonight. But this wasn't over. Eddie let out a slow whistle. "Moreau? Man, you really stepped in it." He ran a hand through his hair, thinking, if he's involved, that means money laundering, dirty politicians, maybe even the feds. You don't just clear your name from something like this, Callahan. You disappear. Frank's jaw tightened. He had spent his whole life chasing criminals like Moreau. And now, the same system he had fought to protect was turning against him. But running wasn't an option. "No," he said firmly. "I don't run. I fight." Eddie shook his head, but there was a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Then you better find something real, something big. Evidence that can't be erased." He pulled a burner phone from his jacket and tossed it into Frank's lap. "I'll see what I can dig up, but after tonight, we're on borrowed time, man." Frank took the phone, nodding. He looked down at Billy, who was watching him with unwavering loyalty. He had lost everything, his badge, his reputation, even his freedom. But Billy was still here, and that meant one thing. As long as he had his partner, he wasn't done yet. Frank sat in the dimly lit motel room, the scent of old cigarette smoke clinging to the walls. The room was cheap, a temporary hideout, but for now it was the safest place he could find. Billy lay by the door, his ears twitching at every distant sound. The German Shepherd hadn't relaxed since the attack, and neither had Frank. He stared at the burner phone Eddie had given him, debating his next move. If Moreau had people inside the system, any call to an old contact could be a death sentence. He needed proof, something they couldn't erase, something that would expose the truth before they got to him first. The phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A single message flashed on the screen. Warehouse 17. Pier 4. Midnight. Bring no one. Frank exhaled sharply. He didn't trust it, but he didn't have the luxury of caution anymore. If someone was willing to meet, it meant they had something, or they were setting a trap. Either way, he had no choice but to go. Eddie wasn't thrilled when Frank called him. "You just survived one ambush, and now you're walking into another?" He hissed through the line. "This screams setup, Callahan." But Frank was already strapping on his shoulder holster. "If it is, I'll know soon enough," he replied. "If it's not, this could be our way out." There was a long silence before Eddie finally muttered, "Damn it, fine. But if you get yourself killed, I'm not dragging your sorry ass out of there." Billy trotted up as Frank slid his gun into place. The dog knew, he always knew, when things were about to get dangerous. Frank knelt beside him, running a hand through his thick fur. "I need you sharp tonight, partner," he murmured. Billy huffed in response, his tail still. His eyes locked onto Frank's like he understood every word. As midnight neared, Frank wheeled himself through the darkened docks, the salty air thick with fog. Warehouse 17 loomed ahead, its rusted metal doors slightly ajar. Billy moved ahead cautiously, sniffing the air, his posture tense. Frank's fingers hovered near his gun. Every nerve in his body screamed that this was a mistake. But then he heard it. A voice from inside, trembling, urgent. "Callahan? You have no idea what you're up against." Frank sat motionless in the dimly lit motel room, the flickering neon light from the parking lot casting an eerie glow through the half-broken blinds. The stale scent of old cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant clung to the air, a reminder of how far he had fallen. Just weeks ago, he was a respected lawman. Now he was a fugitive, hiding in a rundown room with nothing but a burner phone and a German shepherd who refused to leave his side. Billy lay stretched out near the door, his ears twitching at every distant noise. The dog was restless, sensing Frank's unease. He hadn't relaxed since the gunfight at the parking lot, and neither had Frank. He knew they were running out of time. Whoever wanted him gone wouldn't stop until the job was finished. He exhaled slowly, staring at the burner phone in his hand. Eddie had given it to him as a lifeline, but it felt more like a countdown clock. He had spent years tracking criminals, dismantling organizations, and following the money. Now, for the first time, he was the one being hunted, and he was still in the dark about why. His mind replayed the moment he saw the government plates on that SUV. This wasn't just Moreau. This went higher. The deeper he looked, the more it felt like he was uncovering something that was never meant to see daylight. The phone buzzed, the small screen lighting up in the darkness. A single message. Warehouse 17. Pier 4. Midnight. Bring no one. Frank read the text twice, his grip tightening around the device. Could be a lead. Could be a trap. Most likely it was both. He had spent decades reading between the lines, and this message carried the weight of desperation. Someone wanted to talk, but they were too scared to do it in daylight. That meant they had something real, something that could break this case wide open. He glanced at Billy, who was already watching him, waiting for his next move. An hour later, Eddie's voice was hissing through the line. "You just survived one ambush, and now you're walking into another? This screams setup, Callahan." Frank ignored the warning as he strapped his shoulder holster in place. "If it is, I'll know soon enough," he replied. "If it's not, this could be our way out." There was a long silence before Eddie finally muttered, "Damn it, fine. But if you get yourself killed, I'm not dragging your sorry ass out of there." Frank smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Good. I don't plan on dying tonight." Billy trotted up as Frank adjusted his firearm. The dog knew, he always knew, when things were about to get dangerous. Frank knelt beside him, resting a hand on his thick fur. "I need you sharp tonight, partner," he murmured. Billy huffed in response, his tail still. His amber eyes locked onto Frank's like he understood every word. And maybe he did. As midnight approached, the docks loomed ahead, shrouded in thick fog that rolled off the water like ghostly fingers. Warehouse 17 stood in the distance, its rusted metal doors slightly ajar, swaying with the wind. The salty air was heavy, mixing with the faint scent of oil and decaying wood. Frank wheeled himself forward cautiously, every muscle in his body tight with anticipation. Billy moved ahead, his body low, sniffing the air, his posture tense. Something was off. The silence wasn't natural, it was the kind that came before a storm. Then, from inside the warehouse, a voice, low, trembling, filled with urgency. "Callahan? You have no idea what you're up against." Frank rolled cautiously into the warehouse, his senses razor-sharp. The damp air smelled of rust, oil, and salt water, a reminder that they were near the docks, a place where people and secrets often disappeared. The dim overhead light flickered, barely illuminating the cavernous space. Wooden crates were stacked haphazardly against the walls, and the concrete floor was cracked and damp, slick with condensation. It was the perfect place for an ambush, but Frank had come anyway, because he needed answers more than he feared a bullet. Billy moved ahead, his powerful frame low to the ground, muscles coiled like a spring. His ears twitched, his nose flared, and his breathing was measured. The dog sensed something. Frank knew better than to ignore it. His fingers hovered over the grip of his pistol as he spotted the man standing in the shadows. He was thin, mid-30s at most, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. He clutched a worn leather folder to his chest like a lifeline, his hands shaking. Whoever he was terrified. "You Callahan?" the man whispered, barely audible over the distant sound of waves lapping against the dock. Frank remained still, scanning the room for threats before responding. "Depends. You the one who sent the message?" The man hesitated, swallowing hard. His gaze darted toward the warehouse entrance, then back to Frank. "My name is..." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. I worked for the Justice Department, until they tried to kill me." His voice trembled as he took a shaky step forward. "They think I'm dead." Frank's jaw tightened. He had spent his life tracking criminals, but this wasn't just organized crime. This was something bigger. "Who's they?" he asked, his voice steady. The man exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the folder. "Moreau is just a tool," he said. "The real power is behind the scenes, judges, senators, high-ranking officials. They've been laundering money through government contracts for years. Moreau enforces their silence. Anyone who gets too close," he paused, shaking his head. "They disappear." He shoved the folder toward Frank, his hands trembling. "This is proof. Names, dates, transactions, everything." Frank reached for it, but the second his fingers touched the folder, Billy let out a deep, menacing growl. The hair on the dog's back bristled, his body tensed. Then, behind them, the warehouse doors slammed shut. Frank's blood ran cold. A fraction of a second later, the sharp click-click of safeties being switched off echoed in the empty space. They weren't alone. It had been a trap all along. Frank didn't hesitate. The moment the safeties clicked off, he threw himself to the side, pushing the wheelchair's wheels with all his strength. Billy lunged forward, snarling, his powerful body a blur as gunfire erupted inside the warehouse. Bullets ricocheted off metal beams and crates, sparks flying through the dimly lit space. The informant let out a panicked cry, diving behind a stack of wooden pallets as gunmen moved in from the shadows. It had been a trap from the start. Frank hit the ground hard, rolling as he yanked his pistol free. His body screamed in protest, old injuries flaring up, but he shoved the pain aside. Billy had already taken one of the attackers down, his jaws clamping around the man's wrist, forcing him to drop his weapon. A second gunman turned his rifle toward the dog. Frank didn't let him. He squeezed the trigger. Asterisk, asterisk, 1, 2, 3 shots. Asterisk, asterisk, the man staggered back, collapsing with a grunt. The informant was scrambling toward Frank, his face pale with terror. "They knew I'd contact you," he gasped. "They're going to bury us both." Not if Frank had anything to say about it. He grabbed the folder the man had dropped, shoving it into his jacket. It was the only thing that mattered now. Evidence. Proof. If he could get out of here alive, the entire operation, Moreau, the corrupt officials, the names behind it all, would finally be exposed. Billy snarled, his fur bristling, as more men stormed into the warehouse. They were closing in. Frank's mind worked fast. There was no way he could fight his way through this. He needed an exit. His eyes flickered to the overhead catwalk, leading to a high window. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. "Billy, move!" Frank shouted. The dog darted toward him, dodging another spray of bullets. Frank fired 2 more shots to keep the gunman at bay before turning to the informant. "Climb! Now!" The man hesitated for half a second, then bolted for the metal ladder leading up. Frank followed, using every ounce of strength to haul himself upward. Billy was fast, leaping onto crates, scrambling up behind them as bullets tore through the wooden beams below. They reached the window. Frank didn't stop. He raised his gun and fired at the glass. It shattered. Cold night air rushed in as the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. "Eddie," He must have called it in. "Jump," Frank ordered. The informant hesitated, then climbed through the opening. Billy went next, landing gracefully on the roof below. Frank took one last look down. Moreau's men were shouting, regrouping, but their time was up. With a deep breath, Frank let go. He hit the rooftop hard, pain shooting up his back, but he didn't stop moving. Billy was already at his side, nudging him forward. Below, police cars skidded into view, red and blue lights flashing. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn. Backup had arrived. Moreau's men hesitated, then started scattering. They had lost their window to kill him. Frank had won. Hours later, in a secure location, Frank placed the folder on a table in front of the FBI. His hands were bruised, his body sore, but his mind was sharp. He had fought too hard to let this slip away now. An agent flipped through the documents, his face darkening with every page. "This is enough to bring them all down," the agent finally said. He looked at Frank, respect in his eyes. "You just blew open the biggest corruption case in decades." Frank exhaled, running a hand through Billy's fur. "Good," he said, "because I'm tired of running." Billy huffed beside him as if agreeing. The fight was over. Justice would be served. And for the first time in weeks, Frank knew he had finally cleared his name.